Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion Seminar Series for the final week. My name is Nako. I'm part of the AVETH Diversity team, and today I will be hosting this session. So this seminar series is organized by the AVETH Diversity team, and we are an organization run voluntarily by PhDs and postdocs, and we advocate for the rights and representation of scientific staff at ETH Zurich. The aim of the diversity team is to make ETH a more diverse and inclusive place for everyone. So before we begin, I will give a short overview of the schedule, procedure, and guidelines for today's session. The talk will be around 40 minutes, and afterwards we will have a question and answer session. If you have a question, please type it in the chat box, and we will ask the question to the speaker to facilitate a conversation. The general guidelines of the seminar are: please leave your camera turned off and remember to type your comments and questions into the chat box. While we anticipate no issues, you will be immediately removed if you use any harmful or hate speech in the chat box. So now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Maria Miriti. She is a professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology at Ohio State University. Dr. Miriti's pronouns are she and her. Dr. Miriti received her PhD from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and her research incorporates experimental and demographic methods to address factors that regulate plant populations. And currently, her lab is focused on native and exotic plants in the Colorado Desert in California. Dr. Miriti's recent publication, Hidden Figures in Ecology and Evolution, is a call to tear down racial and institutional biases in the sciences for women of color, whose scientific contributions are undervalued. Another publication of hers, The Elephant in the Room, Race and STEM Diversity, identifies 3 factors with the common theme of awareness of the importance of social identity in academic success, and these have strong potential to improve diversity in the sciences. Today, Dr. Miriti will provide examples of racialized conflicts in ecology and evolution that influence faculty and students and offer strategies that acknowledge racial issues and show promise to enhance retention rates and support greater diversity and inclusion. Thank you again all for attending, and please type your questions and comments in the text box for the question and answer session. Dr. Miriti, please begin when you are ready.
Okay, thank you for the invitation to present my work in your department, and I hope that everyone is well and staying healthy. As ecologists, we're attracted to diversity in nature. We recognize that genetic diversity within populations and communities increases their ability to persist in a changing world. Although we acknowledge that diversity within our ranks increases our ability to pursue professional interests and to fulfill professional responsibilities, we've not done a good job of attracting and retaining a diverse population from undergraduates through full professor and also in non-academic settings in ecology and environmental biology. And so what I will share today are some data on participation in STEM broadly, biology and ecology and evolution specifically, and then discuss barriers to participation and strategies that can improve retention of diverse students and faculty. When we consider the demographics in US academic institutions, you can see that 75% of full-time faculty are white. We can also see that 80% of full professors are white. And you'll also notice as you go from lower ranks of assistant professor to professor, that the participation of women goes down. And this is true for all of the ethnic groups that are included in this particular image. We can further examine if there's variation in the demographics of recent PhDs between STEM and non-STEM disciplines. And so these are data that have been collected from a number of public universities throughout the United States and for a number of disciplines that are in these institutions. They're listed here. And then in this table, you can see the breakdown of representation in specific disciplines. And so if we focus on Black PhDs, you can see that the greatest representation of Black PhDs is in education. Also that the representation within STEM disciplines is low. And this is compared to white PhDs that are predominant through all disciplines included in this study. In addition to low representation, faculty of color are institutionally marginalized. One way of showing this is by salary gaps that people are receiving. And so this particular image shows 4 groups, including women, and it is decomposed by a number of variables. And so if we were to, for example, just focus on a university where a person is working, you can see that ethnic groups, right, are receiving a little bit more compared to white men, whereas women are experiencing less overall. Other decomposition variables include the field of study, the amount of time a person has been a faculty member, the prestige of where they got their PhD, and their research productivity. So when we consider all of these factors that might influence salary, you can see that Black faculty are receiving close to $18,000 less a year compared to white men. You also may notice that women are earning less than Black faculty in general, but it's important to recognize that this category of gender is not decomposed by racial group. And so this includes all ethnic and racial minorities that are women. Ecology is an extremely white discipline. When we look at the PhDs that have been awarded in ecology and evolution, you see a pattern that is similar throughout other biological programs, that women are earning more PhDs relative to men. But when we look at racial identity, you can see that the discipline is close to 88% white. African Americans or Black PhDs represent a little less than 2%. And then there's greater representation by Latinx and Asians, and a very small representation by Native American or Indigenous people. This low representation is important. Okay, if only 2% of the PhDs are awarded in ecology and evolution, right? This translates to the experience of individuals, whether students or faculty. This 2% of PhDs awarded in ecology are distributed through many institutions. And what this means is that most participants of color are going to be singletons in any academic space. And this is particularly true for Black scholars. This particular image that I'm sharing with you is from the award ceremony from the Ecological Society of America meeting a couple of years ago. And this, getting this award for diversity enhancement in ecology dovetailed with an interesting time in my own academic journey. My experiences of being the only Black woman, whether, from my undergraduate experience through my current faculty position, and my frustrations with the lack of change in this status led me to take a sabbatical leave to try to understand the lack of racial diversity in STEM and ecology and evolution in particular. Now, what I'm sharing with you here on this slide are images that may be familiar. In the lower panel, you see people championing gender diversity in a professional setting. And then here you see an image showing the value of gender and racial diversity, in this case, in sociology, and featured in the middle of this image is a young Black woman. And so clearly institutions are valuing the need for diversity. But what I found in my research is that caring about inequity is insufficient to remedy inequity. And what I concluded that if what we want is greater racial representation in STEM, then we have to confront race. This image that I'm showing you is looking at degrees awarded to women. This is data that are collected over many years periodically by the National Science Foundation. Now, even though it says social sciences here, this includes psychology and biology. And so when we look at the degrees awarded to women, you can see over time in all of these categories from undergraduate through PhD, that the representation of women has been increasing over time. Now, much of this increase can be attributed to interventions on behalf of women to promote greater representation. From the previous slide that I showed you, it's very apparent that these increases have not translated to non-white identities, and this is particularly true for African Americans. One challenge with these types of interventions is that they're colorblind. And by colorblind, what this says is when people will say things like, I don't see color, I just look at the qualifications of candidates for people's PhD labs or for professional positions. They just look at those qualifications and choose the best person, independent of race. Now, again, we can see that there have been gains by the representation of women in STEM, but a challenge is that colorblind interventions exclude women of color. Part of the problem with this is that this is a single axis intervention. And so single axis, which was defined by Kimberly Crenshaw, shows perspectives that will look along a single axis, and then they can cultivate additive approaches that use lenses that might describe someone, for example, the woman in this picture, as a woman and then Black. In other words, the assumption is that there's a common experience among all women, right, that is then modified by race, rather than acknowledging that the experiences of women of color may be unique. And what is problematic about colorblind perspectives is that they disregard the privileged experiences of white women at the expense of discrimination that is experienced by women of color. Intersectionality is a term that has recently been advocated to respond to the fact that people have several identities, and this is true for all people. There's racial identity or gender identity, ability, etc. When we disregard color, we're disregarding the racialized experiences of people of color, and this leads to continued discrimination along that axis. This understanding is not new and was first mobilized by women of color and their allies during the women's rights movement. The image that I'm sharing with you here is from the Combahee River Collective, which was organized in 1974. And part of what it is that they were asserting is that there is no trickle-down social justice. Advancing women's rights with a colorblind perspective has favored white, predominantly middle-class women with less advancement for Black, brown, and transgender women, in particular for trans women of color. And so the statement that is on this banner, "We cannot live without our lives," reflects the recognition of these women, primarily women of color, that the identities of women of color should not be suppressed if what we truly want is broad representation. Intersectionality as a concept can be hard because there still is a temptation to consider all of the axes piecemeal. And so what I'm showing here are several identity axes, and what I want to consider is my own experience as a Black woman in ecology and evolution. So when we look at all of these axes, right, some of them have disadvantaged me, some of them not that much, and some of them put me right in the norms of whatever group I might be belonging to. So if we consider the axes of socioeconomic class, gender, and race, I know that these have disadvantaged me as a Black woman who went to high school and grew up in a poor urban area. But is this a fair way of describing my experience? On the one hand, we can compare metrics and outcomes. We can look at my salary or what professional rank that I have achieved to date, etc. But this really doesn't capture experience. The other thing that is provocative, right, is that we can consider interventions that have advanced white women and how well it is that they have worked for my own professional existence. And so it might be fair to say that I've been allowed an education and I've achieved a professional position, right? But it would be a stretch to say that the access to resources and opportunities that I have had have been equal to those or equivalent to those of my white women peers. And so if we can accept that identity is an important component of diversity, how does identity influence student recruitment? And so to contextualize this, I'm going to present to you some data from Ohio State University. But Ohio State University is a land grant institution, public institution that serves people from the state of Ohio. So first I want to share the demographics of Ohio. Ohio is a predominantly white state, 78%. The largest ethnic minority in the state of Ohio are Black people, with lesser representation from other ethnic identities. Ohio State University is in the city of Columbus. And so if we look at the demographics of Columbus, we see patterns that aren't too unusual because urban areas do tend to be more racially diverse, as you can see here, compared to non-rural areas. And so there's greater ethnic diversity in the city of Columbus compared to the state of Ohio. However, when we look at the student population, and in this slide, this is all students at Ohio State, one pattern that is pretty blaring is that the university, this public university, is whiter than the state of Ohio. When we look at faculty representation, that statistic is not true, but part of this is largely explained by the overrepresentation of Asian faculty on our campus. Again, this is much greater than the representation of Asian people in the state of Ohio. Now, when we look at our major that we offer in my department, in other words, future ecologists, you can see that Black representation in the three majors that we offer is really, really low, okay? It reflects the disciplinary representation. And this is even much lower than what we see in the biology degree at 7.1% representation. The 7.1% is reflective of the percentage of Black undergraduates here on campus. Now, pipelines are a broadly considered analogy for recruitment. And so if we can increase the representation of minorities entering into the STEM pipeline, then we can produce greater PhDs. And so this is from the cover of Science magazine a long time ago in 1992. But one of the challenges with the pipeline is that when you have a very diverse number of students that enter into the pipeline, what exits the pipeline is predominantly white. And you can see a lot of the diversity by these different colors that are leaking out of the pipeline. And so this is a problem that persists, but there are problems with the pipeline metaphor. And the first of these is that minorities are entering undergraduate programs at increasing rates. The other problem with the pipeline metaphor is that it overemphasizes preparedness. In other words, if we could improve the number of ethnic minorities that are taking math in particular and other science classes in high school, then they would have better success matriculating in STEM biology, STEM programs in college. But one of the challenges with that is that studies that examine what scientists were taking when they were in high school, many scientists weren't even interested in STEM when they were in high school, which means that they weren't taking the calculus, the chemistry, the physics, all of these courses that some people use to explain the low matriculation of non-white students in STEM. Another way of showing this data is to look at the representation of non-white students versus white students that are entering college and that are getting bachelor's or PhDs in STEM. And so we have two data points here, 1992 and 2019. And this is data from ASI in 2020. So if we look at the US population, you can see that the US population has become more diverse with greater numbers of non-white people from 1992 to 2019. You can also see that an increasing number of non-white students have been entering colleges, and this is greater than the representation in the population. And then you see attrition in both windows of time in STEM degrees for bachelor's and for PhDs. This data, though, is a little bit misleading when we want to be looking at patterns of retention. And so if we normalize the data to focus on retention between 1992 and 2019, and we look at two populations, non-peers and peers, and peers is a term that ASI advocates, and what it represents is persons excluded due to ethnicity and race. But what you can see is that the patterns of retention are the same, right? They really haven't changed from 1992 to 2019. And so then what this means is that we need to be considering what are the barriers to retention of students entering STEM programs. A frequently overlooked consideration is how is it that science is produced? In other words, what is it that we value and what is it that we communicate? And ideally, science is objective. And so this word diagram is showing words like scientific. We have a scientific method. We collect data. We make observations, right? All of these things that we value in science are suggesting that it's an objective process. This is in contrast to culture, which is not scientific. Culture are values that are passed on from relatives or people who are part of some community who share similar values and ideas. But it's challenging to think, are scientists so different? In other words, does a student adhere to a particular paradigm because they've examined all the alternatives? Or is it that they adhere to a paradigm because that is what their advisor's research program was based on? And so we frequently disregard cultural and social influences on scientific practice, but it's important to recognize that knowledge and culture are co-produced. We're educated in social spaces, and identity is an important component of scientific development and achievement. And so this particular word cloud, shows things that figure prominently like identity, legitimacy, authority, right? And these are important, when we think about, success. But it's also important to recognize that identity is an important component of social belonging that can influence student success. And so studies show that race influences social belonging in academic spaces. Research suggests that students of color expect to be perceived negatively in interracial interactions, but they don't have this sense of baggage and experience, expect to be received positively in intra-racial interactions. Results have also shown that when you pair students, a Black student with a white student, if the Black student knows that the white student has a racially diverse network of friends, then that Black student does not expect to be challenged in conversations right? And expects to be perceived positively with that white student. But the opposite is true. If the Black student knows that the white student has a racially homogeneous social network, then that Black student expects to be challenged in conversations and to be perceived more negatively. In other words, to have their legitimacy challenged. In contrast, white students expect to be perceived positively and to not be challenged, independent of any knowledge of the social network of their Black partner. Many engaged in pedagogy also recognize the importance of a scientific identity to support retention of students from diverse backgrounds. And this is literature that you can find the support or the significance of a scientific identity for students from K through 12 through graduate and postdoctoral students or scholars. So for a scientific identity, there are some things that you want to keep in mind. This suggests abandoning tokenism, promoting self-efficacy, and providing research experiences that promote inclusive community. And so yes, skills are important, but research shows that students with a positive scientific identity or a strong positive self-efficacy will perform well. And there's even research in ecology that suggests that students with a strong ecological identity will seek out the resources required to overcome technical proficiency or skill deficits. In other words, a diverse group of students will have varied experiences, with some having more obstacles than others. Part of success in the academy, or to foster success, are three things: rule orientation, role orientation, and value orientation. And I've added the term integration. In other words, don't assume that everyone has the same values or has the same understanding of how it is that the academy or the discipline works. These must be clearly and sensitively presented to all students, independent of their background. There are a couple of programs in the United States that emphasize scientific identity and promote self-efficacy that have shown a lot of success in matriculating underrepresented undergraduates who go on to graduate or professional school in STEM. And so these include the Meyerhoff Scholars Program, the Biology Scholars Program at UC Berkeley, and also recruiting students into PhD programs from HBCUs, which are historically Black colleges and universities. Part of the success of these programs and that can help support a scientific identity is that the students are not going to be the only person of color in their program. And so having a cohort of diverse students builds community and fosters success. How does this translate to ecology? Well, in ecology, the field experience is frequently identified as the most transformative experience that solidifies an ecological identity. And so this is important to offer students. However, when we promote a field experience, we disregard differences in access to natural areas, and also racialized concepts of pristine nature that have defined the locations and the processes that underlie research emphases. We also disregard the racialized attitudes of the people who promoted what we identify as pristine nature. So here we see a scene from Yosemite, which is considered pristine, and then other natural areas, perhaps an urban riverway, aren't considered pristine, for example. Okay, and so these concepts undervalue the values and the knowledge of the natural world that originate from other cultures, and these include Black, Latinx, and Indigenous cultures. And it's interesting that only after this past summer of protest and racial awareness have organizations such as the Sierra Club recognized and acknowledged the racism behind the pristine values of nature that they promote. So it's important then to understand that people's experiences of the natural world inform the types of questions that are pursued. This image that I'm sharing with you is from a recent paper that came out in Science magazine. And so what you see here at the top is some type of representation of the natural world that will have ecological and evolutionary patterns and processes. And when we look at people's experiences here at the bottom, people's experiences of the natural world are going to be influenced by a number of filters that are identified here. Vectors of landscape heterogeneity that have to do with the distribution of resources, green space, heat islands, etc. All of these things will influence people's experiences of the natural world. Okay. And what these authors found is that structural racism and classism have measurable impacts on how it is that people, in this case in urban areas, are experiencing nature. Okay. And what they found is that the distribution of access to natural areas is more strongly correlated with redlining. What redlining is are segregated housing practices that were institutionalized after World War II in the United States than present socioeconomic status. With some colleagues, I've been advocating that ecological and social perspectives are required in order to achieve environmental sustainability, which is depicted here. In other words, if we have a socio-ecological system here that is kind of blurry, but if you look at it with the social lens, people will be focusing on people and how it is that they're behaving and what it is that they're experiencing, which can foster some type of social justice. What we do as ecologists is we use a biophysical lens, which means that we're going to be capturing the flora and the fauna in this particular situation. And we can look at distributions of ecosystem services. If what we want, however, is environmental justice, which we argue is required to get global environmental sustainability, we need to use a multifaceted lens that includes both social and biophysical experiences. And that's the only way to get clarity on how it is that ecosystems are functioning broadly. Another way that traditional views of nature have favored activities of those with privileged backgrounds and access to the natural world, they've disregarded other cultural identities and ways of knowing the natural world. And so if we're truly interested in diverse participation, we have to recognize that what we commonly do is we'll bring diverse people with diverse backgrounds, into established ways of knowing and being. And basically what that means is that structural and institutional biases are remaining intact. If we want to truly be inclusive, then we should promote biocultural diversity as an acceptable way of knowing. And so we celebrate diversity because it improves our science, right? It brings innovation. Much of this is what we see in the literature. However, there are a number of challenges that we have to overcome. Habits of thought and presentation are hard to change, and this includes how we teach. In other words, what is it that we have in our textbooks? A lot of it favors very old, established ways of knowing at the expense of more novel presentations. And so I'm not saying that we need to not teach the Hutchinsonian niche and recognize the value of people like MacArthur in promoting quantitative ecology and the understanding of competition. But if we stay with this, then what we're presenting is a predominantly white male discipline which is what we're trying to combat. And at the end of the day, there have been a lot of women and people of color who have made important contributions to ecology. We also have to overcome contradictions in our scientific practice and be more accountable. So this is a study that came out in 1997 that was examining evaluations of men and women who were applying for postdoctoral fellowships, okay? And so the mean competence score of men and women are a function of their scientific productivity, right? In other words, the number of papers that they're producing and how it is that that is perceived. The total impact on the bottom is the more physical, tangible, measurable way of examining this. And so total impact here is the number of papers that these candidates are producing and the prestige of where it is that this work is being placed. And so even with equivalent impact measures, the competence score of men was always higher than women. Okay, so it's important to reiterate this. These men and women had equal scientific productivity, but their competence was not measured the same. And what more accurately traced the competence score was the scientific network of these men and women. In other words, the relationship between the evaluators and the networks of the candidates, with people with strong male connections getting higher scores than those who did not have those. We also need to follow through. So if we value innovation, right, then we need to promote the people who are providing this innovation. And so this is from a recent study that came out in PNAS. And so there's two axes. We have a gender axis, and so this is going from from very diverse to homogeneous gender groups, and then the same with race. So 100% is racially homogeneous, and as you go down, then you have greater diversity along the axis of race. In the top panels, we see novelty. And so this is novelty of what was being produced by graduate students in their dissertation research. And so you can see that as you go from diversity to homogeneity along gender axis, and similarly along racial axes, that as you go to homogeneous groups, novelty goes down. Okay, so we value diversity, and this is measurable. It's producing greater innovation. And this is corroborated here by looking at the incidence rate. Here you see some mean expectation. And along gender axis and racial axis, you can see that the incidence rate of novelty is very high. However, when we look at the impact of this novelty, the opposite is occurring. That novelty is taken up more highly when we have gender homogeneous groups, and similarly along racial homogeneous groups. And again, this is seen by looking at the incidence rate, where you have our expectation, and along gender and racial groupings, the uptake or the acceptance of novel research findings is low for women and for non-white people. So there still are issues of identity. Colleagues of color experience more pressure to conform to demographic expectations, given pressure from peers and students alike. So this image is from a commentary that came out in Science this summer about a graduate student who was describing his experience of taking off his mask. In other words, trying to just let himself present himself as his authentic self when teaching students, because it was just too much work for him to try to present a clean-cut, racially neutral experience. And this is also reflected in a statement by Joe Graves, who is a well-seasoned evolutionary biologist, where he says, I love this work, but I do not love that you want me to become you to do it, expressing and reflecting this pressure to conform. And so diversity shouldn't just mean a more colorful group of participants and practitioners. Structures also need to change to permit more diverse ways of knowing and being if science is really going to advance. And so in other words, the success of these young people is as much about what they learn as it is how they are authentically accepted in whatever academic paths they choose to pursue. And so this is an image from a colleague of mine, Gillian Bowser, who has been doing interventions to provide opportunities for students from diverse backgrounds to have research experiences in natural areas in the United States. And so I want to return to this slide of the decomposition of wage gaps by ethnicity and gender. Because I've been focusing mostly in this talk about entry points. And so we know, however, that teaching, research, and service are the metrics of hiring and promotion, with research being the most valued, okay? And so when we look at decomposition of wage gaps here, I want to focus for a little bit on how it is that research productivity contributes to wage deficits. And you can see that for Black and Hispanic people, that this particular measure is much stronger than it is for women and than it is for Asian colleagues, okay? And so there's documentation of what psychologists refer to as racial battle fatigue. And what this is reflecting is the experiences of racial microaggressions that Black faculty experience at rates that are 2.5 times more likely compared to faculty of other ethnic groups. And so faculty of color have experiences that are mediated by racial identities. This leads to undervalued research, right? And the service that is largely, especially diversity work, that is conducted by faculty of color is undervalued, okay? And it's not gonna lead, in other words, it's not gonna lead to getting a promotion or getting hired, even when that is in STEM. So what I'm showing here are what I'm calling identity crises, right? These are issues of identity that lead to marginalization of faculty of color in this case. And without going through them one by one, you'll notice that a lot of these have to do with the social experience of being an academic, okay? And these are experiences of marginalization. Thinking about the salary deficits that I just showed you about research productivity, this is showing the research productivity score as a function of stress due to subtle discrimination or microaggressions. And so you can see we have white men and women and men and women of color. So everybody is experiencing some amount of microaggression. But the pattern in terms of research productivity is different for white scholars than it is for scholars of color. For white scholars, the experience of discrimination, it seems like people dig in their heels and work harder and become more productive, hyper-productive, I guess, relative to some norm. Whereas this degrades the research productivity of scholars of color. And so I want to share with you some closing thoughts. Greater recognition of cultural and social biases in ecology and evolution can be an important step to developing inclusive practice and teaching. Acceptance and removal of biases in academic reward structures may improve retention of diverse faculty. Interventions that promote self-efficacy, in other words, scientific or ecological identities, can help improve student retention. Greater communication or interaction with diverse communities in the context of local environments. So for example, greater engagement with environmental justice. may help break down disciplinary stereotypes and foster broader interest in ecological careers. And finally, recognition and mitigation of institutional biases that hinder primarily faculty of color can improve retention and promotion of underrepresented faculty and help improve the achievement of diversity goals. And so in closing, I added a quote from Michelle Obama, because I'm here in the United States and we're in very, very, very turbulent times. And, you know, would that we would be able to choreograph our lives and have things go the way that we want to. But we can't always control our life, right? And we can't solve everything. But if we're courageous, right, that can be contagious. And more than hope, but being committed to making the changes that we want to see in order to achieve the outcomes that we value are important, in particular, in this case, in achieving broader representation in ecology and evolution. And so with that, I will close and say thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for the talk, Maria. That was really amazing. I think one of the quotes you said that really resonated was that caring about inequity is really not enough to tackle inequity. And I think the last quote that you also ended with really encourages us to be committed to the changes that we want to see. And so I have a few questions myself, but I'll start with a question that was already in the chat box. And in the meantime, I really encourage everyone to post any of the questions you may have. And so this is from Mark. He says, I appreciate your conversation about the connection between pristine and nature. I wonder how you think we should be proactively making sure ecosystem restoration does not overwhelmingly deploy the dogma of a restored ecosystem as being pristine and thus belonging to a certain people more than others. Do you know of people doing research on this topic, and is it an issue?
That was kind of long. Let me see if I can see it. So was it prestige in nature or pristine?
Pristine in nature.
Pristine.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, we run a lab in our ecology class here at Ohio State, where we have the students look at biomass accumulation at the trees on campus, right? And because carbon storage, for example, isn't only occurring in forest preserves, right? It's occurring on campus, it's occurring in our neighborhoods, right? And so there's ways that we can integrate this reality in the way that we present ecology. When we talk about ecosystem restoration, I'm trying to read the whole rest of the question. Hold on. Oh, don't worry about the clunky question. Let me just try to get through it. So do I know of people doing research advocating that restored ecosystems should be pristine versus not? And the short answer is yes. I can't think of the papers right now, but there are a number of studies where people are targeting some type of an ecosystem function, for example, that is being preserved. There are studies of people that might even include non-native species if those non-native species are fulfilling an important role in, for example, non-native plants that might be fostering broader bird communities, right? In particular, if the native species is no longer present or able to be, has been extirpated from an area. And also, I should mention that there are a lot of studies of restoration. Kariva being one person that comes to mind, although he's not my favorite example, of how it is that people have to be included in restoration targets, because the activities of humans is so strong that we impact any natural area. And so a restoration is never going to be towards some benchmark historical target, and we need to accept that. So I've rambled a bit, but I hope I answered your question.
Thank you so much. Moving on to the next one from Charlotte. She says, you mentioned color blindness early in your talk. In the light of that, what are your views on blind conference submissions and blind hiring processes?
I think that that is still challenging, and recognize that what I'm presenting is from my experience in the United States, but I believe this to be true everywhere. There are biases in access to information, right? With people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and people from non-white identities having to play catch up, right? And so if you are using a double blind perspective, right, this is not going to increase opportunities for underrepresented groups, in particular those who have not experienced the privileges that are tracked with being white. And so interventions are going to have to take that into consideration. So, and in support of that, when you look at the performance of people of color who come into academic programs, so here in the United States, for example, from affirmative action, the test scores that they had, which are typically lower than white students, do not predict their performance in college. They perform really well when given the opportunity. So I would not advocate for double blind. I think that people's background needs to be taken into consideration given the unfair experiences of people in other spaces, and especially in the spaces that lead to professional success.
Thank you, Maria. Next question from Antonios. Tokenism is mass discrimination. Do you have any tips to identify and tackle it?
Wait, tokenism is what?
Masked discrimination. I guess a form of discrimination that is not as apparent as other forms of, it's not as direct, but how would you identify it and tackle it?
That, yeah. I think it has to be abandoned, right? I'm a little bit tokenism. So hiring somebody just because they have a certain background, if that's what you mean by tokenism, I think that no, that's not bad. I mean, I think we have to be targeted if we're going to be increasing diversity. But I think that parading that person around, right, and expecting them to fulfill some type of token role in a professional setting is bad. And the way you identify it is that you pay attention to how people are being treated, how opportunities are being distributed in professional settings. And if a person is there just to be there, but is not really being treated equally, then that has to be remedied.
Thank you. And maybe I can squeeze in one last question since
Sure.
I don't see any other ones. As students and postdocs at an academic institution, what can we do to convince our institutions that take this colorblind approach that is not really aware that racism exists, that not enough is being done?
Can you say the last part of what you said?
That if we're, for example, in Switzerland, if it's a much more homogeneous institution to begin with, and if people don't think that there's a problem to start, how can we as students or postdocs at a much lower level in the institution tackle this problem or make others aware higher up in the organization?
I think you have to call it out. I know that here in the US, students have really been at the forefront of a lot of the calls for racial equity. In my department, I'm offering a seminar on structural racism, and part of this is in large response to graduate student interest in the topic. Some of the studies that I showed you a lot in terms of gender bias and racial bias, these are quantitative studies, right, that support that color blindness is not going to promote diversity. And so even in a racial homogeneous, more racially homogeneous community, which I guess Switzerland is, although the people that I'm seeing on the slides seem to do have, names of diverse backgrounds, right? If diversity is valued, then I think you have to fight even harder, right? Perhaps recruit more broadly, from other countries, which, again, looking at the names, it seems like it's happening, and offer positions and increase the visibility of the diversity in the discipline. You have to pay attention to what it is that the institutions are saying that they want, right? And pay attention to ways or areas in which these are being tackled versus not. And, colorblind practices will not achieve that. And there's a lot of resources that support this.
Thank you so much. And I think I really appreciated all of the really quantitative papers that you shared with us. And maybe you can actually give us some links after your talk that we can share with the attendees if they wanted to look into that. That was really nice to see.
Thank you. I might need a reminder.
I will remind you. I'll send you an email. But I think at this point, there's no more questions in the chat either. And so I'll bring this seminar to a close. Thank you so much again, Maria. It was a really wonderful talk. And before we end, there's just 2 announcements that I want to make. Iris, can you share the slide? Perfect. And so we wanted to make 2 announcements that Aveth will be continuing to work on this diversity front. And so we will be starting a monthly social justice and science library club starting in December, where we will read and discuss texts related to ethics, equity, inclusion, and justice that are applicable in our daily lives as scientists. And so if you'd like to participate, please email Mark at the email listed right there. And as one of our initiatives to also bring awareness to multiculturalism and the impact diversity can have on driving research and innovation, we are inducting an annual Aveth Diversity Award to honor an ETH scientific staff member who has contributed significantly to advocating for diversity in our community at ETH and beyond. So we really want you to nominate people that you know around you, and we would like to highlight this person for this award in March, at the end of March on the 31st. And so that's all from me. Thank you everyone again for attending all of the seminar series and hoping that we can continue this drive for diversity and inclusion in the sciences. So thank you all so much.